All right, AP Environmental. This is Unit 3, Topics 3, 7, and 3, 8. I'm going to divide this into two short videos. So this is the first of the two. I'm going to go through a lot of statistics and data and graphs in these in these two videos. So really kind of focus in and pay attention to those things as soon as I get to those. I want to first start off today um, explaining kind of the difference between what a developed and a developing country is. Whenever we talk about human populations, I mean, we tend to look at them, by country. We'll look at the overall population of the planet, but then, when you kind of get into it, you kind of try to get into the individual countries that make up every place on earth, right? So um, a lot of population data um, is similar based on what type of country it is. I mean, for example, like in a developed country like the United States, and a lot of like Eastern European countries and places like that, we see a lot of very similar population data. Whereas if you look at like a developing country, like a lot of African countries, for example, then we tend to see a lot of data that's very similar between them. So, when we're looking at population data, we tend to kind of we like to look at the developing world and the developed world kind of separately because their data is so contrasting to the other group. So let's talk a little bit today about what's some of the differences between a developed and a developing country are. Again, when you think of a developed country, think places like the U.S. We have a high level of industrial development, high levels of affluence, which basically means like the average household income is pretty good, compared to a lot of other countries around the world. We have a fairly stable government system. We have access to proper health care, and we have good education opportunities. Whereas if you talk about a developing country, they are nowhere near the level of industrial development that we have, let's say, in the United States, but they might be on their way. It kind of depends on what stage of a developing country they are. They have a lower level of affluence, so that means probably not a lot of money. We just read that article about living on less than $500 a year. A lot of people in developing countries do live that way. They have unstable governments for the most part, at least historically they do. Poor health care, but it may be improving. And then finally, less educational opportunities, especially for women. That's kind of a key. We'll talk about that in a little while. But one of the big ways that a country can transition from being a developing country to a developed country is just providing more educational opportunities, not just for men, but for women. That seems to be a very critical thing. Kind of looking here at this graph, the first of several graphs that you'll see in the next couple videos. This is showing us the top 12 countries in the world by population size. And a couple of things stand out here. Number one is there are two countries that far and above anybody else as far as population size goes. This is 1.3 billion people that are currently living in China. This chart's a little bit outdated, but 1.3 billion people who are currently living in China. 1.37. In India, they're a close second, with a little bit less than China. But these two countries here are the most populated countries in the world. The United States, which is the third most populated country in the world, you see where they are, see where we are. We're way below them. But what I want you to understand about these two countries is that both China and India are developing countries. In fact, all these countries that are in blue are developing countries, whereas the countries that are in purple, those are developed. So of the top 12 most populated countries in the world, 9 out of 12 of them are developing countries. So we have a lot of our overpopulation problems tend to be found in these developing countries around the world, especially China and India, which are kind of the outliers. All right, we have a term here. It's called total fertility rate. Um, this is a fairly simple term. And this I'll just read it to you. It says it's an estimate of the average number of children that each woman in a population will bear throughout her childbearing years. Now, childbearing years, that doesn't mean like her entire life, because, when she's 3 years old, she's not having kids. When she's 84, she's not having kids. So this is between the ages of puberty and menopause, which for most women is probably around the age of 12 or 13 to, I don't know, maybe in her 50s or maybe early 60s, somewhere in that range. It's the range of time in her life in which she is capable of having children. And again, it does vary from woman to woman, but this is a number. How many kids will the average woman have in a country? Now, in the United States, that number is about 1.8. Yeah, it's a decimal because it's an average. You can't have zero point 0.8 of a kid. I understand that. But in the US, it's 1.8. Um, in the developed world, you know, most countries are around there. They're around that 1.8 range. Might be a little higher, maybe a little bit lower, depending on the country. But developed countries, in general, tend to have lower fertility rates. I'm going to go to a graph real quick, or go to a chart. I can bring this up. Here we go. This is from 2015, so it's a little bit outdated, but you'll notice here there's the US, right? Our TFR is about 1.84. Canada, it's about 1.6. Mexico, it's about 2.2-ish. But what I want you to really kind of look at is over here in Africa. And I'm going to be pointing to Africa quite a bit in these next couple of videos. But when you get to some of these countries, I mean, Mali 6.1, Niger 7.5. I mean, some of these fertility rates are just crazy high, right? I mean, these are all developing countries. And you'll notice that their fertility rates are, much higher than the developing or than the developed world. So I want you to remember this. All right. Yes, the U.S. has a TFR of about 1.8, but developed countries like the U.S. they tend to have lower fertility rates compared to developing countries around the world. Here's another graph here that I think is kind of an interesting. It has some interesting points to kind of note. Here we have our fertility rates. Okay, so you'll notice, for example, as you go up, there's this is how many children per woman. You get to some of these African countries, for example, those fertility rates get up in the fives and sixes, etc. Whereas in the U.S., like here's the U.S., right, our fertility rate's like 1.8 ish, so it's like a little bit below two. But we're comparing fertility rate to per capita income. How much money per person, right? So, for example, if you look at all of these African countries, all of these developing countries, those high fertility rates, you'll notice that they're not make those people are not making a lot of money, right? Um, China is kind of an interesting one. China has a fertility rate of less than two. Um, And you'll also notice that again, the average person in China is making less than $10,000. Now that what's interesting about China is they've just recently gone to below two. You got to remember the one child policy. That's been around for about 25, 30 years or so, but for the longest time before that, their fertility rate was way higher than that. But I think the biggest thing that I want you to understand with this is that the lower the fertility gets, the more money or the more per capita income there is. I don't know what's going on over here in Luxembourg, but I mean, those people are making like over 100 grand a year. I mean, that's crazy. But I don't know. I mean, I think this graph is kind of telling, that the more children that you have, the higher that fertility rate, the less income you're going to make. Okay, so keep that in mind. This is kind of an interesting graph. It kind of tells us a little bit about developing countries and affluence, for sure. Sorry, guys, I got a little bit sidetracked there. All right, this graph here, this is kind of showing us a little bit more about fertility rates. And in this case, it correlates fertility to education. Let's just take, for example, the country of Nigeria here. Okay, so you've got these three bars. We've got this purple bar here, which represents women that have no education at all. So, for example, in Nigeria, if you're a woman and you have no education at all, then on average, you're going to be having about 7 kids in your reproductive life. Imagine that, about 7 kids in your reproductive life. If you have some primary education, let's say you have some grade school education, maybe you've gotten a fifth grade education, then you're probably going to have about 6 kids in your life. If you have secondary education, let's say you have a high school diploma, maybe a college degree, then your fertility drops down to 4. And what's interesting about that is that you see this trend pretty much in every one of these countries. And these are all, again, African countries, all these developing countries. That, as you go from, let's say Ethiopia here, if you have no education to some primary education to some secondary education, that level of fertility drops tremendously. So I mentioned this earlier that one of the keys to getting these countries out of the developing status and into a more developed status is they have to lower the fertility rates of these women. And this graph is kind of showing us exactly how we can do that, right? It's through education. So if women become more educated, they are much less likely to have a lot of kids, right? That kind of makes some sense, I would hope. All right, so that's an interesting graph as well. Make sure we understand what that's telling us. All right, last thing here I want to cover today, or at least with this video, is it's a concept called replacement level fertility. Now, replacement level, that's a little bit difficult to understand, but I'm gonna use this picture down here at the bottom with this little family of 4. Okay, so you got mommy and daddy, and they've got their 2 kids, right? Whatever. Now, replacement level is basically how many children you have to replace the adults in the family. So you would think, like, for example, say in the United States, in fact, let's say like my own family, I have 2 kids, right? So let's say that this is me and my wife. Okay. I mean, one day my wife and I are going to die. I mean, we're going to die eventually, right? So how many kids would I have to have, my wife and I have to replace the the 2 of us who are going to die? Well, you would think that the answer would be 2. And for the most part, it is 2. I mean, in a developed country, The replacement level fertility is about 2.1. Now you might say, well, why is it 2.1? Why is it a little bit higher? Well, the reason why that is because for every baby that's born, let's say in the US, I mean, is there a chance that that baby may not survive to have children? Yeah, there's a chance of that. Now, in a developed country like the US, our children have a really good chance of living and reproducing one day. But that's where that point one comes in. All right. So in a in a developed country like the US, our replacement level fertility is just a little bit above two, just barely. Okay. Now, imagine if it was a developing country. Imagine, if, okay, let's say, so here's our family here. Let's say this is a family in Nigeria. How many kids would they have to offset, again, the two adults that are going to die eventually? Well, the thing is, in a developing country, the infant mortality rate is so much higher. These two kids that are born, that you would think would be the ones to replace the adults, their chances of survival in, let's say, Nigeria or let's say another African country, those numbers aren't as high. So, I mean, those families are going to have more children to offset the likelihood that those children may not survive to make it to adulthood. So the bottom line is, in a developing country, the replacement level fertility is generally higher than 2.1. It depends on the country, but it might be 2.5, 2.8, 3.1, depending on, again, the country that we're talking about. But what I want you to know is that in developing countries, it is higher than 2.1. All right. That's what it is in the US and developed countries. But in developing, it's going to be higher than that because their infant mortality rates are much higher. All right, guys, I'm going to stop the video here. I'm going to pause it, and then I'll start the second video.